Hello everyone, and welcome to the very first booktube review from me in 2018. On the 11th day of Vlogmas did Willow give to me. Maybe I should start singing that from now on. I don't know. Today, I'm going to continue reviewing my Dark Tower read-through selections, and today I want to talk about Hearts in Atlantis by Stephen King. It is not a direct Dark Tower book, but there are a lot of Dark Tower connecting points and references, and it is kind of one of those like linchpin books. Not necessarily that you have to read Hearts in Atlantis to understand what's going on in the Dark Tower, but that there's a lot of valuable information that will help you in further Dark Tower books. And I finished it in 2017, and I'm just now getting to the video, so I apologize for that, but things happen. So Hearts in Atlantis is less a full novel and actually a series of novellas and short stories, but they all interconnect around a group of characters that start out as young children in the 60s. We start off with the first story, which is called Low Men in Yellow Coats. And this is actually the story that the movie Hearts in Atlantis is based on, even though that particular title connects to a short story that has nothing whatsoever to do with low men in yellow coats. The writers just liked the title better, and so they stuck with it and rewrote some dialogue to make the title work, kind of. But the story is of a young boy named Bobby Garfield who lives with his mother and meets this elderly gentleman who turns out to be very important in the world of the Dark Tower. For those who haven't read it, I don't really want to give a lot away, but let's just say that the low men of the title work for the Crimson King, who is trying to gain access to the tower, and they need Ted Brautigan to do it. What I really like about this first story is you get to see the low men, and there's another book called The Regulators, which Stephen King wrote as Richard Bachman, that also deals with the low men, apparently. And I have a copy of it, I just haven't read it yet. And it's going to be one of the books that I read once I'm done with the Dark Tower reads. But the low men are kind of beast men in a way. Like they pass as human, but they're not really. And there are certain tells that give them away. For example, the cars they drive, the clothes they wear. They have a system of symbols and the lost pet posters that they use to communicate with each other. So if you start seeing a large number of these around, then the low men are nearby. But this is just a great story because you have this young boy who's, trying to figure out his place in the world, meets this father figure, which is something that he has been lacking. And even though his mother is against Ted, he does wind up befriending him, and Ted recommends like a lot of quality books for him to read, and just kind of like broadens his mind and opens his entire worldview, both through just the person that Ted is and the books that he recommends, and the dealing with the low men and, things that Bobby never would have imagined being possible in the real world. And while a lot of the focus is on Ted and his story, it is mainly about Bobby Garfield and his childhood growing up in this small town. The next story, which is the title story, Hearts in Atlantis, takes place a couple years later as the generation that includes Bobby Garfield is going off to college. And it involves Carol, who is one of Bobby's childhood friends and who had a bit of a crush on him during the first story. But now she's off at college, and even in this one, she plays a secondary role. It doesn't follow her story. It follows the story of an entirely separate narrator who gets involved in kind of a crazy moment of Hart's obsession at his college, and his grades wind up suffering, and he almost gets kicked out of school. And a lot of his classmates do get kicked out because they stop going to class. All they do is play hearts. And so you know, we get sucked into this world of weird obsession, and even the narrator, while he's stuck in this, gets like trapped in it, and he realizes he's being trapped in it, and he doesn't quite understand why he's there, and it's like something preternatural, but at the same time it's kind of not. And, you know, you're just starting to get, you know, a lot of like anti-war sentiment from Vietnam, and that's because that's the point that this is happening. And, you know, Carol, who, you know, our narrator in Hearts in Atlantis is infatuated with, gets wrapped up in the anti-war movement. So you have these characters that are kind of going their separate ways and becoming their own people. And it's something about this book. I don't like. It's tough to explain. I guess it's like the melancholy and lament that King works into these characters for the things they were going through in this age, and the kind of the lost moments that they realize after the fact that they lost and could have had better times, but the situation just didn't work out. Following Hearts in Atlantis, we have another callback to some of the characters from Low Men in Yellow Coats, but none of the main characters. In fact, this is following along with one of the antagonists from Bobby's past. Because in Low Men in Yellow Coats, we're introduced to these rival boys from this Catholic school. And they are just cruel and, you know, unusually sinister, especially towards Bobby and his friends. And now we get to see what has happened to one of those kids once they're grown up. And this one I really don't want to go too much into because it is such an interesting story. And there's something about the way that this character, like the kind of the situation that this character finds himself in based on the events that occur in Low Men in Yellow Coats. The thing about Hearts in Atlantis, it covers 30 years. It starts with Bobby Garfield and friends, you know, in their youth, and follows them into adulthood. And we get to see what becomes of these characters. You get to see what happens to this one kid who was a major bully in Bobby Garfield's life, and what has become of him now. And like I said, it is a truly fascinating story, and I don't want to go too much into it, but I think it's one of my favorite stories in this book. Low Men in Yellow Coats, of course, as far as Dark Tower connections, you know, it sits right at the top. But for my money, I have to say Blind Willie is one of King's most unique and fascinating stories as far as just basic character. Blind Willie is... Even if you don't read this whole book, read Blind Willie, because you will not be disappointed. After that, we actually go back to another of Bobby Garfield's childhood friends who wound up going to Vietnam, and he also wound up dating Carol. So it's funny how all these like minor connections kind of, you know, just follow these various characters through their stories. And what we have in the next story, which is Why We're in Vietnam, is, you know, the men who served now in their full adulthood. The year is 1999, and they're looking back, and they're actually at a funeral for a friend, and you're following along. Sully, I believe is his name. Sully John, who is the third friend in Bobby Garfield's little friend group of Bobby, Carol, and Sully John, who we first meet in Low Men in Yellow Coats. Is one of the men who goes off and fights in Vietnam, has now returned and has, you know, picked up his life and, you know, has a life, has a wife, has, you know, grown into adulthood. And now he's back with some of his war buddies, reminiscing about old times because they've just lost one of their own. And I believe it was cancer that got that one. This story takes an interesting turn, and I was like super confused as to what was going on, and The payoff is worth it, sticking through the confusion. And that's what I love about Stephen King storytelling, because he'll just jump into a moment and you'll have no idea what's going on, and like all these random things start happening, and you're like, this didn't feel like this kind of story, but it's Stephen King, so I'm going to keep riding it, because I'm not sure where this is going, but I want to see. And then the final story in this particular book is called Heavenly Shades of Night. And that actually comes from a song that is referenced throughout Hearts in Atlantis, which is Heavenly Shades of Nights Are Falling. So in the final story, we actually get to catch up with Bobby Garfield in 1999. Due to the events of why we're in Vietnam, it causes Bobby to return to his hometown. Carol, we learn through the course of various stories in here, has gotten involved heavily with the anti-war movement in Vietnam during the Vietnam conflict. She's pretty famous and is actually believed dead. But we get closure in this final story. We get to find out where Bobby is in his life. We get to find out what happened to Ted. We get to find out what happened to Sully John. We get to find out what happened to Carol. So it's interesting, like the entire way this book is set up is just, it's so interesting to me, because you start off with what seems, it's just a very simple, straightforward narrative of, a boy's life. Starts in 1960 and travels through various stories to 1999. So what we get is a book that starts off with the youth of 1960 growing up in this time period and experiencing life in that time, growing up, going through Vietnam, having to pick up the pieces of the world after that, and just seeing kind of what became of them. And that's why I say it has such a melancholy attitude to it. And there's a lament to the characters in this book, and it is such good reading. It really is. Like this one I think is going to be the one that truly sticks with me for years and years to come, because as epic as the Dark Tower story is, this one just has so much heart and so much emotion in it. And up until now, I've always said that it was my favorite Stephen King book, but I think Hearts in Atlantis just surpassed it. So there you have it. That is my hopefully fairly spoiler-free review. I don't really think I mentioned too many massive plot points and reveals of Stephen King's Hearts in Atlantis. I will now be moving on to the next Stephen King book on my Dark Tower read-through after a couple of other books, because I'm currently reading a technical manual on film and television production, and then I'm going to read the new John Green book, Turtles All the Way Down, and then I will get back to my Dark Tower read-through. And the next book in that, I think, is Insomnia. My phone's in my pocket, and I have my reading list, so I can double-check that fact. Yes. That is my thumb. I don't care if I hit it wrong. It's still my thumb. Yes. Insomnia is the next Dark Tower series book that I'll be reading, so that'll be the next Stephen King book that I take up after this technical manual I'm on and Turtles All the Way Down by John Green. So Insomnia will be the third in that list, and that will be my next book in my Dark Tower read-through, which I am hoping to continue and finish within the first month or so of 2018. So hopefully you'll stick around for that. That's all for me today. As always, I hope you're all well, and I will see you tomorrow for what will be the last day of Vlogmas.